Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and today what I want to talk about is a little bit about the evolution of asynchronous code in JavaScript. This is a subject that I've been watching a lot of videos on recently. It's a very interesting topic. Why? Okay, so what does this mean, synchronous, asynchronous? So there's a couple terms to kind of talk about this. When you have synchronous code, that means the code is done in sequential order and you don't move on to the next command until the previous command is complete. Okay, which is fine in many cases. Now, what happens when you have multiple tasks or that won't get done right away? They might get done in a second. They may get done in several seconds. This could really delay the execution of your code and create a poor user experience. We don't want that. There's different ways of dealing with this. There's like multi-threading. So what that means is that you have sort of different parallel chains of code running. Multi-thread. Okay, each thread is a chain of commands. But JavaScript is a single-threaded language, and I think most web languages are. So this means you got to find some sort of other way to deal with this issue of code that's going to sort of slow down your process. Okay, this is something like making a GET request to a server, connecting to a database and pulling information, connecting to an API and pulling information, and other things that may take time and you don't know how much time you're going to need. Okay. Now, Node has some pretty interesting ways of doing with this, Node JavaScript, because of its nature of its event loop. So what you can do is you can sort of find ways to say, hey, you know what, when we hit this event, okay, come back to this later. Okay, so this way your code continues running smooth. It's still a single thread. It's still running one process at a time. But what happens is that it knows when sort of to put certain processes to the side depending on how you code them. Now, in the earlier days of Node, the way you had to do this was through callbacks. Now, what a callback is in JavaScript is when you pass a function as a parameter to another function. Okay, and the way this could work and why it worked well when it came to asynchronous code is because you can determine when you pass a function as a parameter to another function, you can determine when that function gets called in the parent function. Okay, so that way you know that the function doesn't get executed until a response is given. Okay, so basically you have two options. You could define a function somewhere in your code and then call it within the parameters of that parent function, or you could just do like an arrow function or a nested function that's written in the parentheses. And oftentimes if you're only going to do whatever you're doing once, there's no need to write a whole separate function outside, so you'd nest the function in the parameter list through an arrow function. And then what would oftentimes happen is that you might have multiple sort of asynchronous requests you need to do. So each one would need its own callback. And so then what happens, you have a callback within a callback within a callback. So when you take a look at the indentation, it creates this sort of like tree-like shape, which would be called a callback tree. And looking at this code, we refer to as callback hell, because you have so many nested callbacks because, you know, first you need to make this API call, get this information, but what you want to do with this information also requires information from this API, so nested in that is another API call, which there's another callback, so that way you have both sets of information, so you have all these callbacks nested in each other. Okay, eventually they came out with sort of a new feature in the last couple of years called promises, okay? And promises, the promise of promises was to sort of clean up callback hell. So instead of having to nest a callback within a callback within a callback, you would put out your, basically, instead of the function returning a value that's maybe dependent on some sort of asynchronous value, the function returns what's called a promise. And a promise that says, hey, you know what? When we get this data, we're going to bring it back. Okay? And then instead of doing all these nested callbacks, what you do is you do a .then chain. Okay? So basically, you would have the asynchronous function that returns a promise. So this return value would be what's called a promise, which just means, again, a promise of a value in the future. And when that value arrives, so basically when the code sees this, the event loop sees this, it'll be like, oh, this is a promise, this information is coming later, let me continue on executing the next bits of code. Okay, so this was a very struggle for me when I was trying to learn how to use the fetch API, because I would do the fetch command and then I would try to use the information in code right afterwards, not understanding how it worked, and then the code would always just show up as like null. I'm like, wait a second, I called the information and it says the information came in, but it's because the information came in after that other bit of code got executed. because it'll see the fetch function and say, hey, I'm going to go out to this API and seek out information. So for now, I'm going to give you a promise. It gives you a promise right away. It says, come back here later. I'll probably have the information by then. And then continues on with the code. So whatever you want to happen after the information becomes available, you have to wrap up in a .then. So it'd be like .then and then a parentheses with what happens. Okay, so instead of a parentheses within parentheses, it's within a .then. And then if you want to have another thing happen after that happens, it's another .then, and it becomes this .then chain. It's better than callback hell, but still, you know, it gets very layered very quickly. So then even more recently, they came out with some, everything still functions now on promises in a sense. Okay, that's still sort of the new way of doing things, the idea of returning this object that says come back later. Okay, the promise object. But instead of having to do all these .thens and whatnot, they came out with Async Await, which is something I'm still sort of learning how to use, getting used to using, but it does make your code look a lot cleaner, because basically what you do is you define your function as an async function. So when you're defining the function, you just write the keyword async, and this tells it that this code is asynchronous. And then what you can do in the code is that right before anything that's sort of a promisey type function, okay, what you do is you just write the keyword await before it. So async comes outside of the function. That's for you to label the function as asynchronous, and then within the function, anything you want it to wait for, you label as await, okay? And it'll basically say, hey, we're gonna create a promise here, and we're gonna come back to see if this is done later, okay? This way you don't have to chain all these .thens and whatnot, and you can have multiple awaits. The only problem with that is that, you know, then you're creating multiple waits. So there's different ways of doing that. This is where you start using like promise.all and whatnot. There's a lot of really good videos that kind of explain ways of dealing with that. Another sort of initial problem is that before, when you had .thens and promises, you know, you had built-in error handling. So it was easy to create error handling for each individual callback or each individual promise, because it would return something different if it was an error versus a response. While when you're doing await, you don't necessarily have that syntactic availability. There's different ways of dealing with it, such as what I've seen in multiple videos is you do a try catch block, which just means that the inside the try block means do this code, and if there's any errors while doing this code, do what's inside the catch block. Okay, and this way, you know, you catch errors that might be going on in your code that may not be triggering other error handling. So that way you know to deal with them. So yeah, but that's kind of the history of callbacks. So the idea was the goal was always to sit there, how can I make my code look cleaner? How can I have this asynchronous function that some languages don't have available to them, or are needed through external libraries? And JavaScript does have external libraries of dealing with this as well. But now it's built in the newest specs of JavaScript. That makes life a lot easier, makes your code a lot cleaner once you get comfortable with using these new ways of doing things. And a lot of the newer frameworks are built to facilitate the use of these things a little bit more. I think that's one of the reasons why Koa was built by the same people who did Express, because it takes advantage of some of these like newer methods. Because Express can be callbacky in a sense, but you know, even though I've been using Koa as well, at least the way I've been using a very Expressy type design pattern. So my code's still been very callbacky. But you could really make use of async await promises to do a lot of things that need to be done to make your code look a lot cleaner. So, and still be able to make sure that the information you need that's asynchronously retrieved is managed. So my name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Have a great day and enjoy.